No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson&Johnson by Gardner Harris. Introduction: A chance encounter that changed everything. In 2004, New York Times pharmaceutical reporter Gardner Harris arrived early for a flight and sat down at an airport bar. The woman beside him turned out to be a Johnson&Johnson sales representative, and her disturbing story about unethical sales practices and their devastating impact on her family would fundamentally alter how Harris covered not just J&J, but the entire pharmaceutical industry. That conversation sparked a 5-year investigation that would uncover one of the most shocking corporate scandals in American history. For generations, Johnson&Johnson represented the gold standard of corporate ethics. The company that gave us baby powder and Band-Aids seemed to embody safety, trust, and maternal care. To Harris and millions of Americans, J&J was the ideal American corporation. But beneath this carefully cultivated image lay decades of deception, manipulation, and a willingness to sacrifice human lives for profit. This book reveals how one of America's most trusted companies betrayed that trust in ways that contributed to the deaths of as many as 2 million people. What makes this story particularly stunning is the contrast between J&J's public image and its private actions. The company built its reputation on 2 cornerstone products: Johnson's baby powder and Tylenol. These products created what J&J called emotional trust, not just the rational trust other companies earned. This emotional bond, particularly with mothers and babies, became the company's most valuable asset. It was also the shield behind which J&J would hide some of the most egregious corporate misconduct in modern history. Part 1: Consumer Products: The Foundation of Trust and Betrayal. Chapter 1: Johnson's Baby Powder, Asbestos and Deception. Johnson's baby powder was introduced in 1894, packaged in soft white and blue tones that embodied purity and maternal care. Made from ground talc, it was used to soothe diaper rash and became synonymous with infant care. But there was a deadly secret. The talc was contaminated with asbestos, a highly carcinogenic mineral that causes mesothelioma and ovarian cancer. The truly shocking part isn't just that the powder contained asbestos. It's that Johnson&Johnson knew about it since at least the 1950s and chose to hide this information for decades. Internal documents reveal that the company was aware of asbestos contamination, but conducted what Harris calls a scorched earth public relations campaign to suppress this knowledge. In 1976, a damning study from Mount Sinai found asbestos contamination in 10 of 20 talcum powders tested at retail stores in New York City, including Johnson's baby powder. Rather than addressing the problem, J&J attacked the research, tarnishing the Mount Sinai work and eventually pressuring them to issue a retraction. The company referred to baby powder as its crown jewel and golden egg in internal documents. A 1999 presentation boasted that while other companies had rational trust, only Johnson&Johnson also has real emotional trust. As late as 2019, FDA tests confirmed asbestos contamination in the product. By that time, competitors had long since switched to cornstarch-based alternatives. Harris estimates that talc-based Johnson's baby powder remained on the market for 50 years longer than it should have. One pooled analysis suggested the contaminated talc could account for up to 15% of ovarian cancer deaths in Los Angeles County alone. When lawsuits finally forced the truth into the open, J&J attempted to use a controversial legal maneuver, filing for bankruptcy through a subsidiary to freeze nearly all baby powder lawsuits since 2021. The company has tried multiple times to settle claims through bankruptcy court, a strategy that critics say allows them to avoid full accountability. In 2015, a landmark lawsuit resulted in a $2.1 billion judgment against the company, but thousands of cases remain unresolved. Chapter 2. Tylenol. The double-edged sword, Tylenol presents a fascinating paradox in J&J's history. In 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. Someone had tampered with bottles on store shelves. J&J's response became legendary in business schools worldwide. The company immediately pulled 31 million bottles from shelves, issued urgent public warnings, and within weeks reintroduced Tylenol in revolutionary tamper-evident packaging that set a new industry standard. This crisis response became J&J's defining narrative, told to every new employee as something of a corporate prayer. It cemented the company's reputation for putting people before profits and choosing ethics over the bottom line. But Harris reveals a darker side to this story. J&J's own distribution system may have inadvertently enabled the crime, and the company used the incident to build an almost unassailable public image that would later shield it from scrutiny over far more deliberate wrongdoing. Moreover, J&J hid the toxic effects of Tylenol itself. The active ingredient, acetaminophen, can cause severe liver damage and even liver failure when taken in excessive amounts. For decades, the company downplayed these risks. Tylenol overdoses became one of the leading causes of acute liver failure in the United States. Unlike the criminal tampering in 1982, these were deaths caused by the drug itself, and J&J's failure to adequately warn consumers represented a different kind of betrayal. The Tylenol narrative reveals J&J's genius for crisis management and public relations. They transformed a potential disaster into their greatest asset, using it to build credibility that would take decades to unravel. This emotional capital would prove invaluable as the company faced scandals involving products where the harm was not from external tampering, but from deliberate corporate decisions. Part 2. Prescription drugs. Criminal marketing and hidden dangers. Chapter 3. Procrit. Promoting cancer growth. Procrit is a prescription medication that stimulates red blood cell growth to treat anemia. It seemed like a miracle drug for cancer patients suffering from the debilitating effects of chemotherapy-induced anemia. But J&J hid studies showing that Procrit led to catastrophic outcomes, particularly for cancer patients, because the drug actually stimulated the growth of cancerous tumors. Paul Goldberg, editor of the Cancer Letter, cited a breast cancer trial that found nearly 3 times the number of deaths in women receiving Procrit. The company knew about these findings, but continued aggressive marketing to oncologists. They provided Procrit to healthcare providers at low or no cost, while billing Medicare for the full listed price. A scheme that constituted massive fraud against the federal healthcare system. J&J was eventually found liable for Medicare fraud, but not before countless cancer patients received a drug that may have accelerated their deaths. The company prioritized the billions in revenue Procrit generated over the lives of vulnerable cancer patients who trusted their doctors' recommendations, not knowing those recommendations were influenced by J&J's fraudulent marketing practices. Chapter 4. Risperdal. Devastating side effects. Hidden from vulnerable populations. Risperdal represents perhaps the most disturbing chapter in J&J's pharmaceutical misconduct. This antipsychotic medication was approved for treating schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in adults. J&J's subsidiary Janssen Pharmaceuticals claimed it had fewer side effects than older antipsychotics like Haldol. But the company engaged in what prosecutors would call a criminal campaign to sell Risperdal for off-label uses to the most vulnerable populations, children with behavioral disorders, autism, and ADHD, as well as elderly patients with dementia. The side effects were devastating. In elderly patients, Risperdal caused strokes, heart attacks, and increased mortality rates. The FDA eventually forced J&J to add black box warnings about these risks, but not before thousands of elderly dementia patients had been prescribed the drug inappropriately. For children, the consequences were even more horrific. Risperdal increases prolactin levels, a hormone that stimulates breast development and lactation. Young boys prescribed the drug developed gynecomastia, breast growth that could only be removed through double mastectomy. Some boys developed lactating breasts. The trauma of male adolescents growing breasts, often accompanied by severe obesity and metabolic disorders including diabetes, destroyed countless young lives. The company knew about these risks. The original label estimated gynecomastia at fewer than one patient in 1,000. But when a 2001 company reanalysis of 151 boys put the risk at 3.8%, Janssen never forwarded that number to the FDA. Instead, company-funded statisticians manipulated the data, removing boys over age 10 and folding girls into the denominator to artificially reduce the reported risk. Harris argues that with long-term, higher-dose use, the incidence may actually approach 1 in 10. Janssen's own data, revealed in court documents, showed risks of about 5.5% after 1 year and as high as 12.5% after 2 years. J&J paid doctors to prescribe Risperdal under the guise of speaking fees and consulting arrangements. Dr. Stefan Kruszewski, initially hired as a speaker for J&J, eventually refused to cooperate, explaining, "I was given slides and told, 'We'll give you $1,000 if you say this for a half hour.' And I said, 'I can't say that. It isn't true.'" 5 whistleblowers, including sales rep Vicky Starr, filed suit against J&J between 2004 and 2005, alleging illegal promotion of Risperdal for off-label uses. The woman Harris met at the airport bar in 2004 was likely part of this story. The case eventually resulted in massive fines, but the human cost was incalculable. Harris documents how J&J's illegal Risperdal marketing campaign may have caused more harm than the prescription opioid crisis in terms of individual suffering. Chapter 5. Jurogesic and the opioid connection. Jurogesic was J&J's fentanyl patch, used for long-term treatment of severe pain. The company marketed it as a less addictive alternative to Purdue Pharma's OxyContin, despite evidence that fentanyl is equally addictive. This was brazen hypocrisy, because J&J played a crucial, largely unacknowledged role in the opioid crisis that extends beyond Jurogesic. J&J operated vast poppy plantations in Tasmania, producing the raw opioid ingredients that Purdue Pharma used to manufacture OxyContin. While the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma have become synonymous with the opioid epidemic, J&J's contribution as a supplier has received far less attention. The company profited enormously from both ends of the crisis, selling raw materials to other opioid manufacturers and marketing its own fentanyl products with deceptive claims about addiction risk. Harris argues that J&J's deceptive marketing of Jurogesic rivaled even that of the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. The company pushed the patch for chronic pain conditions where less addictive alternatives existed, contributing to the wave of fentanyl addiction that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Chapter 6. OrthoEvra, the deadly birth control patch. The OrthoEvra birth control patch represented another product where J&J hid critical safety information. The transdermal patch delivered higher doses of hormones than oral contraceptives, significantly increasing the risk of blood clots, strokes, and heart attacks. Young, healthy women using the patch suffered strokes and fatal blood clots. Studies showing these elevated risks were downplayed or hidden. The company continued aggressive marketing, particularly to young women, while knowing the patch posed greater dangers than traditional birth control pills. Once again, J&J's pattern emerged: hide the data, attack critics, and maintain revenue streams regardless of the human cost. Factual. Part 3. Medical devices, pain, metal poisoning, and surgical disasters. Chapter 7. Pinnacle hip implants, metal-on-metal disaster. Hip implants are typically made from metal-on-plastic components because metal-on-metal wear and tear causes metal shards to break off, embed in muscle tissue, and poison patients with metal ions. Despite knowing this, J&J's Dupuy subsidiary developed and marketed the Pinnacle metal-on-metal hip implant. The story gets worse. The day before J&J sent its plans for the Pinnacle implant to the FDA, an engineer reported that one of the implants had failed in testing. The company sent the original plans to the FDA for approval, while secretly changing the design without informing the regulatory agency. This was a deliberate act of deception that put thousands of patients at risk. As implants began failing at alarming rates, J&J concealed these adverse events from the FDA. Patients experienced excruciating pain as metal debris from failing implants poisoned their tissue with chromium and cobalt ions. Many required revision surgeries, facing the trauma of having a failed implant removed and replaced. The failure rates were many times higher than plastic alternatives, but J&J hid this data for years. Gradually, orthopedic surgeons became aware of the failures through their own experiences and patient reports. The medical community's growing awareness, rather than FDA action or company disclosure, eventually led to the implant being taken off the market. By then, thousands had suffered needlessly. Chapter 8. ProLift Vaginal Mesh, a medical device catastrophe. ProLift Vaginal Mesh was designed to treat pelvic organ prolapse, a condition where pelvic organs drop from their normal position. What seemed like a minimally invasive solution became a nightmare for thousands of women. The mesh, once implanted, often eroded into surrounding tissue, caused chronic pain, made sexual intercourse impossible, and required invasive surgeries to remove. Surgeries that were often only partially successful. Women who received ProLift implants reported devastating complications: constant pain, inability to sit comfortably, destruction of intimate relationships, and repeated surgeries that left them worse off than before. Some women lived with mesh protruding through vaginal tissue. Removal surgeries were complex, dangerous, and often incomplete because the mesh became embedded in tissue and organs. J&J aggressively marketed ProLift while downplaying these risks. The company trained surgeons on the device and encouraged widespread adoption before adequate long-term safety data existed. When complications became undeniable, J&J faced thousands of lawsuits. The mesh was eventually pulled from the market, but not before ruining countless lives. The vaginal mesh scandal, like the baby powder crisis, revealed J&J's willingness to prioritize market share over patient safety, particularly when the victims were primarily women whose concerns might be dismissed or minimized. Part 4. The COVID-19 Vaccine, Modern Failures. Chapter 9. The J&J COVID Vaccine. Debacle. J&J's single-dose COVID-19 vaccine seemed promising during the pandemic's darkest days. A one-shot vaccine could simplify distribution and improve vaccination rates. But the vaccine development process revealed the same corporate culture that had produced decades of scandals. The vaccine was rushed through development with inadequate quality controls. It turned out to be far less effective than the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, providing weaker protection against COVID-19 infection. More seriously, the vaccine was linked to a rare but potentially fatal blood clotting disorder, particularly in younger women. The FDA eventually restricted its use, and in 2024 it was essentially banned due to the blood clot risks. Harris uses the COVID vaccine debacle to illustrate that J&J's problems weren't historical artifacts from a less ethical era. The same corporate culture that hid asbestos in baby powder and pushed Risperdal on children was still operating in the 2020s. Regulatory failures, inadequate oversight, and corporate prioritization of speed and profit over safety continued to endanger public health. The broader implications. A broken system. Harris doesn't limit his critique to J&J. The book provides a devastating analysis of the entire American healthcare regulatory system. The FDA emerges as a captured agency, too often deferring to industry, lacking resources for adequate oversight, and failing to protect the public. Procrit shows how corporate money corrupts medical science through funding that shapes research questions, influences study design, and determines which findings get published. The revolving door between industry and regulators creates conflicts of interest. Doctors and researchers receive payments from pharmaceutical companies that influence their prescribing habits and research conclusions. Academic medical centers become financially dependent on industry funding, compromising their independence. Medical journals rely on pharmaceutical advertising revenue, creating subtle pressure to publish favorable studies. J&J's influence extended beyond direct regulatory capture. The company threatened media outlets with financial ruin when unfavorable stories appeared. It funded patient advocacy groups that defended the company's products. It paid for continuing medical education that was essentially marketing. Every level of the healthcare system, from basic research through prescription and patient use, was influenced by J&J's financial power. Harris documents how J&J's legal strategy evolved into a core business function. The company became, in his words, a law firm with a drug and medical device subsidiary attached. From very early on, J&J adopted a no-prisoners stance toward litigation. The company doesn't settle unless absolutely forced to, viewing any settlement as an admission of guilt that could open the floodgates to additional claims. This explains why J&J fought baby powder lawsuits for decades, and why transitioning to cornstarch-based powder would have seemed like surrender. The human cost. Stories of victims and whistleblowers. Throughout the book, Harris balances detailed documentation with powerful human stories. We meet boys who developed breasts from Risperdal, facing bullying, psychological trauma, and the horror of needing mastectomies as teenagers. We meet women with ovarian cancer who used baby powder for decades, trusting J&J's assurances of safety. We meet elderly dementia patients whose families watched them deteriorate on Risperdal, suffering strokes and early deaths while trying to manage behavioral symptoms. We also meet the heroes, the whistleblowers who risked their careers and livelihoods to expose wrongdoing. Sales representatives like Vicky Starr, who filed suit against J&J despite knowing they would face industry blacklisting. Doctors like Stefan Kruszewski, who refused to deliver corporate talking points even when offered substantial payment. Researchers like Paul Goldberg, who published findings about Procrit's dangers despite industry pressure. Investigative sources who illegally provided grand jury files because they found the company's conduct so singular. These whistleblowers put themselves at considerable risk. Grand jury files are protected by law. Providing them to a reporter is a criminal offense. But Harris's sources believed the public needed to know the truth badly enough to risk prosecution. Their courage made this investigation possible. Systemic failures and solutions. Harris concludes with proposed reforms to prevent future J&J-style disasters. His recommendations focus on three areas: strengthening regulatory oversight, reforming corporate accountability, and restoring integrity to medical science. For regulation, Harris argues the FDA needs more resources, more independence from industry funding, and more aggressive enforcement powers. Penalties for corporate misconduct must be severe enough to deter violations, not just representing a cost of doing business. Criminal prosecution of executives, not just corporate fines, could change the calculus of risk. For corporate accountability, Harris suggests reforms to bankruptcy law that prevent companies from using it as a shield against legitimate lawsuits. The Texas two-step maneuver, where companies create subsidiaries to absorb liability and then file for bankruptcy, allows corporations to avoid full accountability for their actions. This loophole must be closed. For medical science, Harris calls for stricter conflict of interest rules. Researchers and doctors receiving industry money should be barred from serving on FDA advisory panels. Academic medical centers should limit industry funding to avoid corruption of their research missions. Medical journals should refuse advertising from companies whose products they review. Continuing medical education should be funded independently, not by pharmaceutical companies marketing their drugs. Harris emphasizes that J&J's story is not unique. The company's misconduct was enabled by a broken system where corporate profit too often trumps patient safety, where regulators lack resources and will to enforce rules, where science can be bought and manipulated, and where the vulnerable, children, the elderly, cancer patients, women, bear the costs while shareholders reap the profits. The scale of betrayal. What makes this story almost impossible to believe is that it happened at Johnson&Johnson, not some fly-by-night pharmaceutical company, but one of America's most trusted institutions. A company that built its reputation on baby powder and Band-Aids, on maternal care and childhood memories. A company whose credo, written in 1943, supposedly put patients and customers first. But Harris shows how that credo became window dressing, a public relations tool rather than a guiding principle. The same company that responded heroically to the Tylenol tampering crisis in 1982 was simultaneously hiding asbestos in baby powder, planning fraudulent Procrit marketing, and preparing to unleash Risperdal on children and the elderly. The death toll is staggering. Harris estimates J&J's products have contributed to the deaths of as many as 2 million people and counting. Baby powder and asbestos exposure. Procrit accelerating cancer growth. Risperdal causing strokes and heart attacks in elderly patients. Jurogesic and the opioid crisis. Failed hip implants and vaginal mesh. COVID vaccine blood clots. The sum total represents one of the greatest corporate scandals in American history. Yet J&J's market capitalization remains enormous. Its products still fill pharmacy shelves, and many Americans still trust the brand. This reveals the power of emotional trust, carefully cultivated over generations, and the difficulty of overcoming decades of positive associations, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Lessons and reflections. No More Tears forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the systems we trust to protect our health. How could one company cause so much harm for so long? Why did regulators fail to stop it? How were doctors and researchers co-opted into serving corporate interests over patient welfare? Why did media coverage remain largely favorable until lawsuits forced the truth into the open? The answers reveal structural problems beyond J&J, regulatory capture, financial conflicts of interest, corporate legal strategies that prioritize avoiding liability over ensuring safety, and a healthcare system where profit motives can override patient care. J&J's story is the story of American healthcare's dark side, where innovation and profit coexist with deception and deadly consequences. Harris's investigation took 5 years and drew on hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of documents, sealed grand jury records, court transcripts, and whistleblower testimony. The result is not just an exposé of one company, but an indictment of the system that enabled and protected that company's misconduct for decades. For readers, the book serves as both a warning and a call to action. We cannot simply trust corporate assurances, even from the most seemingly reputable companies. We must demand stronger oversight, genuine accountability, and a healthcare system that truly puts patients before profits. The price of complacency, as Harris demonstrates, is measured in millions of lives. Conclusion. Beyond the smile. The title No More Tears refers to J&J's famous baby shampoo slogan, No More Tears. It's a brilliant choice because it captures the betrayal at the heart of this story. The company that promised to protect babies, to ease mothers' worries, to embody safety and trust, instead hid asbestos in the very product that symbolized that promise. The image of babies bathing with a smile, so central to J&J's marketing, masks decades of corporate malfeasance that caused immeasurable suffering. Harris has produced what reviewers have called a masterpiece of muckraking, comparable to Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma. But in some ways, the J&J story is even more stunning because the company's reputation was so unassailable, its image so wholesome, and its products so woven into the fabric of American family life. This is not just corporate history. It's essential reading for anyone who uses healthcare products, sees doctors, takes medications, or cares about how our regulatory systems work, or fail to work. It's a reminder that trust must be earned and verified, that corporate goodwill campaigns can mask deadly secrets, and that the price of regulatory failure is paid in human suffering. The conversation that started in an airport bar in 2004 ultimately produced new federal laws and this landmark work of investigative journalism. But the battle for healthcare safety and corporate accountability continues. As long as profit incentives can override patient welfare, as long as regulatory agencies lack resources and will to enforce rules, and as long as corporations can use legal maneuvers to avoid full accountability, the conditions that enabled J&J's decades of misconduct will persist. Harris has given us the receipts, the evidence, the stories, the data to understand what happened and why. What we do with that knowledge will determine whether J&J's story represents a turning point toward greater accountability or simply another scandal that fades from memory while the system that enabled it continues unchanged. The choice and the responsibility belongs to all of us,